Excuse me, sir. Just one question, just real quick. Are you an ecosystem? Wow. Very interesting. Ma'am, would you be willing to tell me about what you think an ecosystem is? Are you an ecosystem? Wow, really compelling thing. Hey, would you mind sharing with me? Are you an ecosystem? Oh, how about you? Are you an ecosystem? Ah. Ecosystem. You might have heard that word before, or maybe you haven't. And if you have, I'd like to know what you think or thought that word means. Maybe just any kind of natural area, like a pond or a garden, or just any system where eco things happen. The thing is, even if the terminology goes over our heads, every single critter on Earth, humans included, knows ecosystems. We may not always understand them, but certainly by understanding them, our lives can be enriched. Just like knowing how to perform maintenance on your car can make car ownership easier and cheaper, or understanding cooking techniques and nutrition and stuff can make you a healthier mind and body. But if I'm going to sit here and declare that you already know ecosystems, I better clarify. So, an ecosystem is all of the living and non-living things interacting in a given area. Living things are alive, non-living things aren't, and interactions just describes things happening to each other. Pretty simple. And when you consider that living things, especially microbes and germs, are just about everywhere, you might have reasoned that, well, ecosystems must be everywhere. And if that's what you reasoned, you would be correct. Yes, certainly forests and grasslands and all that stuff are ecosystems, but so is a tree within that forest, or an individual leaf within that tree. Whoa. Or even just a single handful of soil or sand, or this rock is an ecosystem. For that matter, my hands are ecosystem, my scalp is an ecosystem, and the pores of my eyelashes are an ecosystem. Look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. This water bottle is an ecosystem. This paper, this desk, everything you see around me is an ecosystem. So I think I've made my point with that, but knowing that alone doesn't really make life better. Except that it's pretty cool. The awareness, just, of all of these things doing all this stuff to each other everywhere around you all the time. All of them constantly affecting one another, including you. Just exchanging energy. Something to think about next time you're staring into the middle distance. It's like I said earlier, though. Understanding things is, of course, the key to making them enrich our lives. So let's start to understand ecosystems, how to describe them and discuss them, how to interpret them and consider them in everything that we do in life. And I hope that with this video and future videos, you're going to see how everything is completely dependent on the stability of its ecosystem. And we're going to learn this in a way that tries to make sure that no one can't understand ecosystems.
You look so tiny.
Believe me, you have all of the tools you need to understand ecosystems. We're just going to make this easier to use those tools. To that end, we're breaking ecosystems today into 5 essential building blocks. The foundation, the base of pretty much everything that happens in ecology, the study of ecosystems. And those building blocks are 1, the geology, or just the rocks and the dirt and how they move around and interact with each other throughout time and space. Like area space, like give me my space, not stars and stuff. 2, the hydrology, or just the way that water moves across and through an ecosystem. 3, the climatology, and to a lesser extent the meteorology, or just the patterns of weather over time and the different weather events on a day-to-day basis. 4, you've got the biology, just the life, everything living in an ecosystem and taking all those little components and changing them into other things. And 5, disturbance, or just like all the stuff that happens to all the components of an ecosystem, the consequences of those other 4 building blocks interacting with each other. Really, disturbance is just the movement of energy throughout an ecosystem. This is like the third eye of the ecosystem. Speaking of third eye, I grew one right here. I don't think that's right. Should I get that? This is an ecology video. Well, never mind. So, all of that being said, be not mistaken to think of these 5 building blocks as essentially separate. All of these building blocks move and change and affect each other in all kinds of ways. So, in a way, they all sort of become one thing. That's why we call them all ecosystems. And the one thing that connects all of those building blocks that I just want you to keep in mind, keep in that noggin to consider for the rest of the video and everything that we talk about, is energy. You eat food and it turns into energy. You move around and you expend that energy as heat and other things, or force. And all anything in an ecosystem wants to do, just like throughout your body, is curate the most efficient movement of energy. And there are some broader investigations into all of these ways that we describe this movement of energy, which you can get some coverage of in the trusty old reliable Restoration Suite videos, which will be linked. And in the future, we're going to continue making videos that are breaking down all of the specifics of everything we're going to talk about today. So if you want to learn more, it's going to be there for you. But with so many interactions to consider, today let's just talk about building blocks. And then let's talk about the 5 essential foundations of ecosystems. Geology. This is like most of a natural ecosystem. And geology is more than just all that stuff about how to identify minerals, or like how Africa and South America used to spoon, but now they sleep on other sides of the ocean. Like, all of the dirt and rocks and everything underneath us and around us isn't just moving around all the time as it floats on the ocean of molten metal that is most of our planet, kind of like Gollum on the lava. But it's important to think of geology in unison with all of the water and weather events that have always and continue to shape it to this very day. Breaking stuff apart, smashing it together into new things, and moving it elsewhere. And it so happens that all of the nutrients and compounds that make up you and almost anything you've ever interacted with are originally derived from this stuff. So it's pretty important. For example, look at the nutrition facts on the back of some food. You see that bottom part right there? Those are just heavy metals, dude. And then there's the soil. And I don't just mean like sand and gravel and stuff like that. I'm talking about all of the stuff that living things have taken up and then ejected, or otherwise effused back into the environment as different stuff, including just by dying. All of the life on Earth is creating the soil that we need and all of the complex little minerals and compounds that we need to survive. So all of that waste and change that life incurs on geology just makes a new kind of non-living stuff for life to interact with. That's crazy. That's so crazy. Together, geology is really the main thing that determines where life can live anywhere on Earth, because it determines where the stuff that can make that kind of life exists. Hydrology is probably my favorite one. We still do not know much about hydrology. Like, I've heard scientists express more confidence over the workings of quantum physics than how water does this. But Hydrology is super important, not just because every living thing needs water, but because water will end up interacting with everything in any ecosystem at some point in time, and thus it takes a piece of everything with it. What I'm saying is that everything ends up at water at some point in its existence. Sediments and acids and oils, toxic stuff, nutritious stuff, just everything, all of it. But it's not just moving across the land. In fact, most of the unfrozen fresh water that exists and that interacts with our ecosystems is underground in great big saturated muddy lake-like things called aquifers, or sometimes just in literal underground lakes. And these can be huge. So naturally, we don't know a whole lot about the ways that water works in an ecosystem. But seeing as every living thing needs it, we better pay very, very close attention to it. Or just consider the fact that it was hydrology in the past that moved great amounts of sediment and rock and water to the places where it is today.
Look what you did.
That's why we have the Great Lakes in the first place. It was just created by hydrology. Go figure. It's water. Now, climatology, meteorology, it's kind of like hydrology, but it's not just water, it's also air, and it's above us, so it's a little easier to observe. The weather, basically. I think most of us have a pretty good idea of how hot and cold and dry and wet affect an ecosystem, because we all have this ecosystem which is constantly in tune with that. But strangely enough, when it comes to the large scale, scientists have a pretty good grasp on how climate works, and we can look millions and millions and millions of years into the past to determine how the climate has changed and how it will continue to change. Where it gets real complicated can be on the small scale, actually. The climate that's created by an individual tree or an individual pad of moss or anything like that can make things a little more convoluted. However, because we have these climate measuring tools built into us, it's also pretty much the easiest aspect of an ecosystem for us to observe. I told you, we've got everything we need already. In fact, we do this all of the time. It's called homeostasis, or just a biological balance. And in order to achieve homeostasis, our bodies are constantly regulating themselves. We're constantly regulating our bodies to respond to hot and cold and dry and wet. So that right there, your body, is as good an example as I can give of energy moving throughout an ecosystem. Now, biology. This is life. Nothing personal, kid. And that means animals, which, yes, includes all the kinds of bugs and worms and everything you can think of, but it also includes plants and fungi and bacteria and protozoa and archaea and all these little things that we just generally call germs. All of which are everywhere, and all of which are absorbing in their own ways the different building blocks and turning them into new things like soil, which they then deposit into the ecosystem. I found some kind of slug coven. They're just plotting. Look at them. I don't trust you. But it's not just through consumption and this cycling of nutrients and energy that biology can change an ecosystem. Plants and fungi do it with their roots and their leaves and canopies all the time, using their very structures to change the ecosystem. And of course, animals do that too. So while we biological beings may be very much at the whim of the other three building blocks, once we get the right balance of those building blocks, we can really take off and do some major things in an ecosystem. You know, plants got their roots and their canopies. We've got our hands or our tusks or whatever have you. It's like the castle to a sandbox. We come into an ecosystem and make it into what it really is. We really determine how energy flows throughout that ecosystem. And we continue to invent new ways to do that by spreading our genes everywhere, creating new mixtures of biology that can change those building blocks in new and different ways, according to evolution, which we won't get into today. And lastly, we've got disturbance. Speaking of the interactions between building blocks, we've actually been talking about disturbance this entire time. And I think you might have a pretty good idea of what it means. Disturbance isn't the only way to describe these interactions, but we are probably going to be talking about it the most. So disturbance really is just the way that energy moves throughout an ecosystem. It's things happening to each other. And everything that happens to an ecosystem can include major weather events like floods and storms, blizzards, wildfires, rock slides, and such. And it can also include the things that, for example, biology does to its ecosystem, the trails that deer make and the holes that critters can dig. Or for that matter, the trails that we make and the holes that we dig. Yeah, just everything we do. Even just the ways that life moves itself around an ecosystem, like with pathogens, diseases, and invasive species and stuff, that is a disturbance. And we humans cause so very much of this disturbance that in ecology it's usually helpful to think of disturbance as either natural or naturogenic, or artificial or anthropogenic disturbances. However, not all anthropogenic disturbance is necessarily bad for an ecosystem, and not all naturogenic disturbance is necessarily good for an ecosystem. The lines can really be blurred, and the disturbances that humans cause can be good for this great foundation of our civilization. So, yeah, that's an ecosystem. It's just earth, water, weather, life, and energy moving around, trying to seek the most efficient path, the best budget for all of the heat and the force and everything else that it generates. That can describe why pretty much everything on Earth happens. It can incorporate every field of every science and math and history and culture. I mean, it is the foundation of every civilization, of every life. That all sounds overwhelming, right? And indeed, ecology is not all that well understood by Western science, but really, how much is? There's still limits to be pushed, and we're going to have to push those limits because pretty much all of our ecosystems, generally, and I mean generally, are on the brink of some kind of imminent collapse, and we can't afford that. We're going to need a lot of ecologists and ecologically minded people in every field of work and profession and education. And that's why we need free ecological information to be available and accessible to everyone. Getting started with that, first, we perhaps should just try to appreciate how everywhere ecology is, just how enormous and complex it is everywhere, all around us. And we are gifted with the tools to observe that, to study it, and to understand how to help it, how to make it better. So, like I said, we cannot afford to have ecological information behind a paywall or a degree or anything like that. So we're going to dive deeper into all of these subjects and so many more in future vids. And again, if you want a broader outlook on these building blocks and the subjects that relate them, go ahead and check out my old Restoration Suite videos. And if you had some thoughts or questions or suggestions of what you would like to learn anytime during this breakdown, please go ahead and comment it below. Go ahead and check me out on Instagram. I'm even on Facebook. And, just, the like and the subscribe and the notification bell and you get it. Thanks a lot for watching, and stay tuned. And just remember, we are all in an ecosystem.